The station stood like a slab of poured concrete, windowless on its lower floors, its entrance framed not by grandeur but by function. A metal door opened with a muted hydraulic sigh, and the father stepped inside. The lobby was lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed faintly, a sound that merged with the low throb of machinery somewhere beyond the walls. The light flattened everything it touched, the pale tiles, the dull benches, the posters on the wall with slogans about community trust. No shadows were permitted here, only exposure. He paused just inside the threshold. His shoes, polished though, worn at the edges, pressed against the waxed linoleum that reflected none of the light. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, layered over the sour trace of old coffee. Behind the counter, a pane of thick glass separated the officers from those who entered. It reflected him back in fragments. Face, coat, the steady line of his shoulders. A clock hung above the counter, black hands on a white face. Its second hand twitched forward in precise increments. He watched it longer than he should have. Each tick seemed to measure the distance between what had been taken from him and what he had come to reclaim. He approached the counter. The receptionist, a young officer with cropped hair and tired eyes, looked up briefly, then back down to a screen. The man placed his identification on the tray beneath the glass. The small plastic rectangle slid forward with a sound too sharp. For such a quiet room, the officer picked it up, eyes scanning without interest. No greeting. No acknowledgement, only procedure. The keys clicked as information was entered. "Reason for your visit?" the officer asked, voice low, rehearsed. The father's answer was stripped to its bones. "My son." The officer did not look up. Another line filled on the screen, a pause, then a nod toward the metal detector. "Have a seat." The words fell like instructions at a factory line, not recognition of grief. He took back the ID when it was returned, sliding it into his wallet with deliberate care. His hand lingered on it. A name, a birth date, a photograph frozen in time, identity reduced to a card that could be passed, scanned, dismissed. He turned and chose a seat. The bench was hard plastic, bolted to the floor. From here he could see the whole lobby. The posters with stage smiles, the door that led deeper into the building, the officers moving in pairs behind the glass. No one looked at him directly, but he felt their glances all the same, quick, assessing, sliding away. The hum of the fluorescent light pressed against his ears. The clock above the counter ticked on. Each sound filled the silence left by everything not said. He folded his hands in his lap. He did not move, did not fidget. His stillness was deliberate. He would not allow this place to reduce him to impatience or fear. The minutes passed. The second hand twitched forward, and in that waiting, the lobby revealed itself. Not neutral. Ground, but a threshold. Here, every visitor learned their place. Here, silence was the first demand. The father sat beneath the humming light, eyes steady, shoulders square. He would not break the silence, not yet. The hospital room was too white. White walls, white sheets, white lights spilling from the overhead fixture that hummed faintly, erasing all warmth. It was the kind of light that belonged in a morgue, more than in a place meant for healing. The father entered slowly, his shoes muffled by the polished floor. At the center of the room lay his son. The boy's frame seemed smaller against the stiff hospital bedding, his body drawn inward as if protecting itself. Bruises painted his skin in uneven patches, purple spreading into yellow, swelling along. The cheekbone, a split at the lip that had not been neatly closed. A monitor beeped in steady rhythm, indifferent to suffering. It measured survival, not pain. The father listened to it, every sound a reminder that his son was alive but not whole. He drew close to the bed, the scent of antiseptic heavy in the air. It coated everything, choking out the familiar smells of home. Soap, sweat, the faint cologne, the boy once stole from his father's shelf before school dances. Here, there was only the sterile sting of chemical purity. The boy's eyes opened briefly when his father leaned near. They were bloodshot, rimmed with swelling, but clear enough to recognize him. Recognition, then retreat. The lids closed again, shutting the world away. Son. The word carried the weight of all his silence, all the nights he had rehearsed. Discipline and hope in equal measure. It landed softly in the sterile room and dissolved into the hum of machines. But the boy did not answer. His lips stayed pressed together, unbroken by sound. Silence had been beaten into him, sealed with fear. Every breath through his nose seemed to say, "I will not speak." The father lowered himself into the chair by the bed. The chair groaned, its metal frame strained by years of waiting bodies. He folded his hands, staring at the IV drip that released measured drops into a vein on his son's arm. Each drop struck with surgical precision, a small intrusion disguised as care. He wanted to touch his son's hand, but he stopped himself. The boy's stillness was too fragile, his silence too deliberate. To reach across might break it, might force a reckoning neither of them was ready for. So he sat, posture rigid, letting the weight of quiet build between them. The monitor kept time. The drip released its steady rhythm. His eyes traced the bruises again. Each mark carried the outline. A force. Knuckles, boots, the long shadow of power unchecked. They had not only struck flesh, they had struck the voice from him. What remained was a body intact but muted, a boy alive but sealed inside himself. The father leaned back in the chair, his hands unclasped, resting on his knees. His jaw tightened, but his face betrayed nothing. Grief was too small a word for what the silence demanded of him. The monitor beeped, the drip fell. His son's lips stayed closed, and in that silence the father understood. The boy's refusal to speak was not only fear, it was a verdict. The desk was a barrier disguised as furniture. Metal legs, laminate top, a stack of forms aligned in perfect squares. Behind it sat an officer in a pressed shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearm, pen already poised as if the father were not a man, but a transaction waiting to be completed. The father approached without hesitation. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind, the naming of wrongs, the demand for accountability, but here, in the stillness of the administrative office, his words felt pre-shaped, already reduced to the language of bureaucracy. "File a complaint?" the officer asked, not looking up. The voice was flat, as though carved into muscle memory. The father nodded once. A form was slid across the desk. White paper, black lines, blank spaces, waiting to absorb suffering and convert it into data. The hue. Officer tapped the top line with the pen. Name, relation, incident description. The father took the pen. Its plastic barrel was slick, cheap. He pressed it against the paper and began to write. Each letter came slowly, his handwriting deliberate, as if by sheer neatness he could keep his son's bruises from being erased. The officer's chair creaked as he leaned back, waiting. The room was silent, except for the scratching of ink. In the corner, a file cabinet clicked as another officer opened and shut a drawer. The sound was mechanical, final, as though swallowing whole other complaints that had come before. When the father reached the section marked Details, his hand stilled. How to compress the violence into tidy sentences, how to render knuckles and boots into the neutral language of policy. He wrote anyway. Beaten while unarmed, excessive force. Result, hospitalized, child refuses to speak. The officer extended his hand. The father passed the form across. The paper looked fragile in the exchange, like something that could tear under the weight of truth. The officer skimmed it with half-lidded eyes, pen-ticking boxes in the margins. A stapler came down with a sharp, metallic crack. Once, twice. The sound was too loud for the small room. Each strike fastened the boy's pain into place, reduced it to evidence among other papers stacked in precise piles. complaint logged, the officer said. No shift in tone, no acknowledgement, only the efficiency of a process designed to move forward without friction. He opened a drawer, slid the form inside, and shut it again. The drawer latched with a muted click. A coffin lid. Closing. The father stood in silence. He had done what the system demanded, filled its blanks, followed its script, yet nothing had changed in the air around him. His son was still silent. The bruise was still purple. The men who had struck him were still in uniform. He turned to leave. The officer was already looking past him, eyes fixed on the next task, the next form. The pen tapped against the desk, impatient for new lines to fill. As the father stepped back into the corridor, the sound of the stapler echoed in his mind. Sharp, final, indifferent. Paper walls had risen around his son's body, and every page made the truth smaller. The conference room was square, windowed on one side, but the blinds were drawn halfway, slicing the daylight into rigid lines. Dust floated in the narrow beams, suspended like evidence that refused to settle. The air was thick, held too long, by recirculated vents. At the center of the room stretched a polished table, its surface reflecting each object with a faint, distorted sheen. Notebooks closed, pens lined beside them, a sweating glass pitcher of water that had not been touched. Condensation slid down its sides and pooled at the base, marking time in rivulets. The father sat at one end, his back straight, hands folded before him. Across from him, 3 men in uniform and 1 in a suit. Rank showed not only in their insignia but in posture. Shoulders rolled wide, hands spread on the table as if to claim it. Their shoes shone under the fluorescent light, tapping once, twice, in unison with the rhythm of impatience. "Mr. Hayes," the man in the suit began. His tone carried a rehearsed sympathy, manufactured for rooms such as this. "We want to assure you that this matter is being reviewed with the utmost seriousness." The father said nothing. His silence stretched into the room like a fourth wall, unmovable. One of the officers leaned forward. "Your son resisted. Force was necessary." The words were clipped, clinical, no detail, no image, only the cover of procedure, the father's. Eyes flicked toward the pitcher. A drop of condensation slipped, fell, merged with the pool beneath it. He remained silent. Another officer cleared his throat, softer this time. These situations, they escalate quickly. Hard to control, unfortunate outcome, but the father raised his gaze, not his voice, only his eyes. They locked on the officer mid-sentence. The pause was immediate, heavy. The rest of the words withered before they could cross the table. Silence reclaimed the room. The man in the suit shifted in his chair. Papers slid from one hand to the other, as though movement could disguise the hollowness of the script. "We'll make sure it's handled appropriately," he said at last, the words dissolving into the stale air. The father exhaled slowly. Not defeat, not consent, simply release. His silence had said what their words could not. He did not believe them. He would not let their half-truths fold the violence into policy. He pushed his chair back. The sound scraped against the tiled floor, sharp and unignorable. He rose, adjusted his coat, and turned toward the blinds. For a moment he studied the slits of daylight leaking through, thin lines of brightness against the stagnant dimness of the room. Without a word, he walked out. Behind him, the pitcher continued to sweat, shoes tapped again, and the blinds remained half-closed, like the system itself, never letting in the full light. The house was quiet in the way abandoned churches are quiet, not absence of sound, but the presence of something missing. The father set his keys on the table by the door. They landed with a hollow clink, a sound that echoed too loudly in a space meant for warmth. He moved through the rooms without turning on the lights. The late evening sun slid thinly through the curtains, laying long shadows across the floorboards. In the kitchen, A single plate sat on the table. He had set it out by habit, though he had no appetite. The fork lay beside it, untouched, the surface of the plate reflecting a dull oval of light from the window. He stared at it, remembering the rhythm of shared meals, the scrape of his son's fork against porcelain, the quick laughter between bites, the occasional silence of teenage defiance broken by sudden bursts of talk. Now there was only the plate, waiting for a meal that would not be eaten. On the wall above the table hung a framed photograph. Father and son, younger, standing side by side on a summer day. The boy's smile stretched wide, unburdened, his arms slung around his father's waist. The father had been caught mid-laugh, head tilted slightly, as though listening to a private joke only the two of them shared. He stood before the photo now, eyes tracing the edges of it, remembering not only the day, but the sound, the living sound, that filled it. He carried the memory into the living room. There, an old lamp stood on the side table, its switch untouched. He lowered himself into the armchair beside it. The lamp remained unlit, its shadow like an unspoken presence. He sat in the dimness, his hands resting on his knees, his shoulders heavy but squared. Silence filled the house. Not peaceful silence, but weighted, oppressive. Every corner seemed to echo with the absence of his son's voice. The boy's refusal to speak in the hospital still hung in the father's chest, heavy as stone. For a long time, he sat without moving. The silence pressed against him, testing him, as though daring him to surrender to its suffocating hold. But he did not bow. He would not let the stillness consume him. He straightened in the chair, spine rigid. The vow formed not in words spoken aloud, but in the clench of his jaw, the steadiness of his gaze toward the unlit lamp. His son's silence would not end here in this house, smothered into nothing. It would be carried forward, translated into something the system could not ignore. He rose from the chair and returned to the kitchen. The plate still waited on the table. He picked it up, washed it carefully, and set it back in its place on the shelf. Order restored, even if only in gesture. The house remained quiet, but the silence no longer pressed in the same way. It had become fuel. The neighborhood carried its own silence, thicker than the hospitals, denser than the stations. Here, silence was survival. Windows closed when patrol cars rolled by. Conversations cut short at the sight of uniforms. Eyes dropped, shoulders stiffened. The father moved carefully, one street at a time, following the trail of those who had seen. The boy had been beaten in plain view. The truth was public, but spoken only in fragments, in whispers, carried behind locked doors. The first witness smoked on a back porch. The cigarette burned fast between trembling fingers, ash falling unchecked onto the wood. "I didn't see much," the man muttered, though his eyes flickered away, betraying more. Smoke curled upward, obscuring his face. He took long drags, exhaling clouds, as if each could erase the memory. The father said nothing, only waited. Silence stretched until the man broke it with a whisper. "Boots." They didn't stop. He stopped moving, but they didn't. The words came quick. Then, ended, the cigarette hissed as it was crushed against the railing. Conversation over. Another witness, a woman in her 30s, spoke behind a chain-link fence. Her hands gripped the wire as if it might steady her. "I've got kids," she said softly. "I can't. They'll come for me if I talk." Her voice thinned, almost vanished. She backed away from the fence, retreating into the dark of her yard. The sound of the latch closing was louder than her words. The father did not press. Fear was its own testimony. By the third house, dusk had settled, shadows cutting the street into uneven patches of light and dark. An older man stood in his doorway, porch bulb flickering above. His voice was hoarse, nearly a whisper. "I saw it. They wanted him quiet. They wanted us all quiet." His hands shook as he spoke, then steadied when he clenched them into fists. He glanced around, eyes darting, to corners as though the air itself might betray him. "Write it down," he said. "If I don't say it again, at least you'll have it." The father wrote in silence, each word landing heavy on the page. Every encounter carried danger, not just for those who spoke, but for him as well. He felt it in the way curtains shifted when he passed, in the headlights that lingered too long at intersections. The system watched, even when unseen. By night's end, his notes were a patchwork of voices, some broken, some clipped short, some refusing to speak at all. Together, they formed a chorus, defined more by what was missing than what was said. Back at his kitchen table, he laid the papers flat. The smell of smoke clung to his jacket, his hands, even the pages themselves. He studied the shaky handwriting, the half-finished sentences, the lines scratched out in fear. Each silence was louder than testimony, each omission its own indictment. He set his pen down and folded his hands. The silence was everywhere now, not just in his son's closed mouth, but in the witnesses who feared theirs would be next. The boy's silence was not singular, it was systemic, and it was growing heavier by the day. The hearing room smelled faintly of varnish and dust, the kind of scent that clung to wood, polished too many times for show, never for use. Rows of chairs faced a raised platform where authority sat, elevated by architecture as much as by title. The father entered quietly, choosing a seat in the back. From there, he could see the full display. Officers in pressed uniforms, brass catching the light, faces composed into masks of discipline. Their postures were identical, as though drilled into the very bone. At the center, a table stood with microphones angled like instruments awaiting players. Their black cords snaked across the floor, tethering every voice to the record. When an officer leaned forward to speak, the sound carried not as confession, but as evidence, sterilized and catalogued. Officer states that the suspect resisted. Use of force was consistent with policy. The incident was unfortunate. Each phrase stripped the body from the violence, the face from the bruise, the child from the boy. The words arrived cold, arranged to protect, not reveal. The gavel struck once. The sharp crack cut through the air, sealing the testimony like a stamp. Not approval, not truth, only closure. The father sat motionless. He did not speak, did not interrupt. His silence was deliberate, a counterweight to their language. If they would bury the truth beneath procedure, he would not dig with words. He would sit as stone, forcing them to perform their theater in his presence. An officer on the stand cleared his throat. The microphone picked up the sound, magnified it. For a moment, it was the only human note in the chamber. Then came the script again, monotone, memorized. The father's eyes drifted to the empty chair beside him. His son should have been there, voice trembling, words halting but alive. Instead, the boy's silence occupied the room more fully than any witness. It hung over every line of testimony, over every denial. They tried to erase him, but his refusal to speak was louder than their carefully rehearsed words. Another gavel strike, another file closed. The system advanced like a machine fed by reports and signatures. When the session ended, the room emptied quickly. Officers stepping in unison, shoes echoing against the floor. Their uniforms remained stiff, uncreased by the weight of truth. Father remained seated until the last of them had left. Only then did he rise, his movements slow, measured. He glanced once at the microphones, still standing in silence, red lights now dim. Tools meant to amplify had done nothing but contain. As he stepped into the hallway, the gavel's echo still lingered in his ears. Each strike had not ended testimony, it had ended truth. The chamber was not built to hear, it was built to close. The courthouse steps were built for spectacle, broad, tiered stone, rising into columns that promised justice but delivered theater. That morning, the space was crowded with reporters, cameras hoisted on shoulders, microphones clustered like a bouquet of black stems at the podium's edge. The father stood beneath the stone columns, coat buttoned, posture erect. He had refused to bring notes. His hands were empty except for the photograph he carried, a framed picture of his son, taken before bruises, before silence. The boy's smile was frozen in the glass, unscarred. The crowd shifted, restless. Camera. Shutters clicked in staccato bursts, the rhythm of impatience. Voices called questions, rapid, overlapping, urgent. Do you believe the police acted unlawfully? What do you say to their claim of resistance? Will you be pressing charges personally? He did not answer. Not yet. He lifted the photograph, holding it high enough for every lens to catch, for every flash to burn into its surface. Silence fell, sudden and sharp. Then he spoke. His voice was low, steady, carrying without effort. My son has not spoken since the night they beat him. Beam. Words hung in the cold air. Shutters stuttered again, but softer this time, almost reluctant. He cannot tell you what they did to him, he continued. So I will tell you instead. They took his words. They tried to take his dignity. They did not succeed. He lowered the photograph, resting it against the podium, the boy's face watching the crowd. I want you to look at him. Not as a report, not as a statistic, not as a suspect. As a child who came home broken by those sworn to protect. The microphones caught every syllable, but the power was not in volume. It was in restraint. Each sentence arrived sharp, deliberate, no excess to soften its edges. They think silence will bury this. They think if he stays quiet, the story ends. But silence can speak. His silence condemns them more than any words could. The cameras flared white, freezing him in that moment. His face calm, his shoulders squared, the photograph gleaming against the black stems of microphones. He stepped back. No questions answered, no elaboration given. He had said enough. The crowd erupted, voices chasing him down the steps, flashes firing like gunshots in the night. But he did not turn. His silence now was not retreat. It was command. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, he paused. He glanced once at the photograph in his hand, then forward again, into the press of bodies and lights. The boy's silence had been carried into the world. It would not be ignored. The first call came at night. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before he lifted the receiver. Silence waited on the other end. He could hear breath, steady, deliberate. Then the line cut. The dial tone hummed like a warning. The second call came the next morning, this time a voice, low, distorted, spoken as if from a mask. Drop it. The click that followed was louder than the words themselves. He set the receiver down carefully, hands steady. But his jaw locked. Unmarked cars appeared outside his house by dusk. Dark windows, engines idling without reason. They came and went. In shifts, sometimes parked across the street, sometimes rolling past slow enough to be noticed. Neighbors closed curtains. The sound of tires on gravel became constant, a pressure at the edge of hearing. Walking to the corner store, he felt eyes on him. The car that trailed half a block behind. The figures that leaned against lampposts, uniforms absent but posture. Unmistakable, every step forward was met with shadow. At home, the phone kept ringing. Sometimes silence, sometimes laughter, sometimes a voice repeating his name in a tone that stripped it of humanity. Always ending in the same click, always the dial tone humming back, steady as a machine. He wrote it all down. Time, date, the words used. He filled pages with their threats, transforming intimidation into evidence. Each note steadied him. If they wanted fear, he would give them record. But the nights were long. Alone in his chair, he listened to the sound of engines outside, headlights passing through the curtains in slow arcs. He watched the glow crawl across the framed photograph of his son, then vanish into darkness again. The silence inside the house grew taut, stretched thin by the pressure of what surrounded it. Still, he did not bend. He understood now that their power was not in force alone, but in suffocation, in pressing until silence became complicity. They had stolen his son's voice. Now they wanted his. But every ring of the phone, every car parked outside, every shadow that followed him only hardened the vow he had made beneath his own roof. Silence would not claim him. The system had closed ranks. The walls were drawing tighter. Yet within that tightening, his resolve sharpened like glass under pressure. They gathered first in whispers, then in numbers. A lawyer arrived with a folder thick as a brick, its corners bent from use. Inside were affidavits, statements from others who had been silenced, bruised, broken. Pages stacked upon pages, each sheet another wound disguised in bureaucratic language. The father read them in silence. Every story mirrored his own. The sudden stop on a dark street, the flash of a badge, the night ending in blood or humiliation. Paper walls again. But now, the walls were breaking, too many to contain. Activists came next, voices sharp, carrying years of practice in the cadence of resistance. They brought candles, plans, strategies drawn on folded sheets. Their language was collective, their posture unyielding. "You are not alone," they told him. But it was not comfort. It was declaration. In a church basement, the community filled. Chairs arranged in a circle. The smell of coffee and candle wax lingered. Old men with walking sticks, young women with notebooks, mothers holding children who fidgeted in their laps. Each carried a story. Each carried a silence broken now by gathering. The father sat among them, not above, not apart. He listened. A man rolled up his sleeve, revealing scars along his forearm. A woman described the night her brother never came. Home. Their voices piled one atop another, a chorus of wounds, and the air thickened with their truth. Hands clasped across tables, documents passed hand to hand. The sound of pens scratching signatures into forms was steady, purposeful. Evidence accumulated in the open, no longer hidden in drawers. That night, outside the courthouse, they held a vigil. Dozens of candles flickered against the stone facade. Their flames bent in the wind, but did not go out. The father stood at the front, his son's photograph against his chest, the crowd's light reflecting in the glass. The silence there was different. Not the suffocating silence of intimidation, not the lonely silence of a hospital room. This silence was weight shared, a quiet that strengthened instead of diminished. He looked at the faces lit by fire, neighbors, strangers, allies, and felt the truth. What had begun with one boy's silence now belonged to many. The fight had widened. The system could not erase them all. The seal of the state loomed high above the judge's bench, embossed in gold against dark wood. It glimmered under recessed lighting, austere and untouchable, as if watching more faithfully than the man beneath it. Rows of pew-like benches creaked. As the crowd settled, the sound swallowed by the vaulted ceiling. The father sat among them still, hands folded in his lap. His son sat beside him, eyes lowered, lips pressed shut. The boy's silence had followed them into this chamber, an unspoken testimony louder than any oath. Lawyers rose and fell in ritual movements. Jackets buttoned, papers shuffled, voices sharpened to points. They spoke in polished phrases, language cleansed of blood and pavement, turned clinical, abstract. Use of force. Procedural compliance. Standard encounter. Words that stripped humanity as efficiently as batons stripped flesh. The plaintiff's attorney pressed forward, Exhibits displayed, photographs of bruises, medical records, affidavits. Each slide projected onto the wall, each wound reduced to evidence. The jury leaned in, eyes darting between paper and boy, between the language of injury and the living body beside it. The defense countered with practiced precision. Their witness raised a hand for oath, uniform crisp, badge gleaming. The stenographer's keys clattered as testimony was given, measured, rehearsed, every syllable designed to absolve. Resistance was observed. Minimal force was necessary. The situation escalated by the subject's behavior. The words hung sterile in the chamber, as though they described weather rather than violence. The father watched, expression unreadable. He said nothing. He could feel the pull of the courtroom's theatre, the duel of rhetoric and precedent, but he knew the truth sat wordless beside him. His son's silence filled the gaps their language tried to cover. When asked to testify, he rose slowly, walked to the stand, raised his hand, spoke few words. They beat my son until he could not speak. No embellishment, no elaboration. The phrase echoed stark against the courtroom's polished performance. The stenographer's keys paused for half a beat, then resumed. He returned to his seat. His son remained still, eyes fixed forward. The silence between them was not weakness but indictment. The trial moved on, arguments volleyed, objections raised, voices rising and falling in orchestrated tempo. Yet above it all, louder than law or rhetoric, remained the quiet presence of a boy who had not spoken since the night he was beaten. The courtroom became theatre, but the silence was the truth no performance could bury. The deposition room was smaller than the courtroom, stripped of grandeur. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their hum the only constant in the silence between questions. A recorder clicked, its red light steady, its presence absolute. Every word here would live beyond the room. The officer sat rigid in his chair, uniform pressed, collar tight. A paper cup of coffee trembled in his hand, dark liquid quivering near the rim. He lifted it, drank, set it down. The ring it left on the table widened slowly, a spreading stain. Questions came steady, measured. The plaintiff's lawyer leaned in, voice calm but relentless. On the night in question, did you witness force being applied to the boy? The officer hesitated. A bead of sweat traced his temple. His eyes darted to the defense counsel, then back to the table. The silence stretched thin until the hum of the lights seemed to grow louder. Yes! His voice cracked on the word. The defense objected, words thrown like a shield. But the recorder clicked on, impartial, unmoved. The tape caught everything. More questions. Each answer shorter, sharper, pulled from him like teeth. His story wavered against the official line, details misaligned. The boy had not resisted. The blows had continued after he was down. He had seen the baton rise, fall, rise again. His breathing quickened. The coffee cup trembled once more. His conscience, long buried under command and fear, broke through in stammered phrases. I didn't stop it. The lawyer paused, letting the confession hang. The recorder clicked softly, steady as a heartbeat. Across the table the father watched in silence. His eyes did not move, his posture unflinching. He knew what this moment meant, not absolution, not yet, but fracture. The wall of blue, solid and suffocating, had cracked. The deposition ended, papers gathered, chairs scraped against linoleum, voices resumed their professional cadence. But something irreversible had shifted. Outside the room, the officer leaned. Against the wall, sweat staining the collar of his shirt. His hand shook as he lit a cigarette, the flame trembling against the paper. He inhaled deep, exhaled shakily, as if the truth he had spoken had left a wound no smoke could fill. Inside, the father remained still for a moment longer, eyes fixed on the recorder as it was switched off. The red light vanished. Silence returned. But he knew. The tape now carried a weight that could not be erased. The system had bled through its own seams. The courtroom was full again. heavy with expectation. The air smelled of varnished wood and bodies pressed too close. Every cough, every shuffle of paper echoed louder than it should have. The father sat in the same place he always had. Second row, hands folded in his lap. His son beside him. The boy's silence had never wavered, lips closed as if sewn shut, eyes fixed straight ahead. His stillness drew as much attention as the trial itself. The judge entered, robe trailing, expression carved from stone. The bailiff called the room to order. All rose, all sat. The ritual carried out with mechanical precision. The verdict was read slowly, each word precise, final. Liability acknowledged, compensation ordered, discipline recommended, but no names spoken aloud, no acknowledgement of violence. Beyond the sterile language of law, excessive force, policy violation, phrases that skimmed the surface, never touching the flesh of what had been done. The defense shifted in their seats, murmurs passing like a current. The plaintiff's attorney nodded once, sharp, satisfied. Reporters scribbled, their pens scratching. Like insects on the page, the father did not move. His hands remained folded, his gaze steady. He had not come for victory, he had come for truth, and truth was not in the verdict. It was in his son's silence, unbroken still. The judge's gavel struck wood. The sound reverberated through the chamber, final and hollow, like a door closing on air. The crowd began to rise, voices swelling, footsteps filling the space. Some looked at him, searching for reaction, for triumph, for anger, for grief. He gave them nothing. He touched his son's shoulder gently, guiding him to stand. Together, they walked down the aisle, past uniforms and suits, past flashing cameras waiting at the doors. Outside, the sky was grey, clouds low and heavy. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust like weapons, questions rapid fire. Do you consider this justice? What do you say to those disappointed by the ruling? Is this the end of your fight? The father stopped, folded his hands in front of him, the same as in court. His eyes scanned the crowd, but settled on nothing. He said nothing. The silence was his answer, his refusal to let their words swallow his own. The boy beside him mirrored it, lips still pressed together, silence still intact. They walked on. The Beeb system had bent, but it had not broken. Justice had been delivered, but only in fragments. The weight of change did not rest in the courtroom's judgment. It rested in what remained unsaid, in the silence that refused to die. The courthouse doors opened with a groan, and he stepped into the light. The marble threshold gleamed beneath his shoes, polished by years of footsteps, by generations of people seeking justice or fleeing its shadow. His son walked at his side, head lowered, lips pressed shut, silence intact. The swarm met them instantly. Reporters surged forward, microphones rising like a thicket of black stems, camera bulbs flashing in sharp bursts. The steps down from the courthouse narrowed into a gauntlet of noise. Questions fired, names shouted, demands hurled into the air. Do you call this justice? Will you appeal? What comes next? The father did not break stride. His coat was draped neatly over his arm, his other hand resting lightly on his son's shoulder. His face betrayed nothing. He moved as if through water, calm against the storm. The boy's photograph, carried all these weeks, was tucked beneath his arm now. The glass caught each camera flash, scattering light back at the crowd, so that for a moment it seemed the boy's face was everywhere, projected in brief, blinding fragments onto stone columns and marble stairs. He reached the middle of the steps. The voices swelled, pressing closer, microphones thrust near his mouth. For an instant it seemed the tide would engulf him, but he stopped. He turned his head slightly, scanning the crowd. His silence was not retreat, it was defiance. He had no words for them, no answers to feed the machine of headlines and sound bites. His silence spoke more than any statement could, the dignity of refusal, the unbroken protest of presence. The shutters fired in unison. Flash after flash, his posture, the coat draped, the boy at his side, the photograph clutched tight, each detail captured, fixed into record. He descended the final steps slowly, unhurried, every movement deliberate. The boy followed, matching his pace, his quiet shaping the air between them like armor. At the curb, a car door opened. He guided his son inside, then followed, the door shutting with a heavy thud that muted the chaos outside. Through the window, the flashing bulbs stuttered on, but the sound could not penetrate. The car pulled away. The courthouse receded behind them, columns shrinking, voices swallowed by distance. What remained was the image burned into every lens and every watching eye. A father walking out, silent, unbent. His silence was not absence. It was presence sharpened into a weapon, and the system, for all its noise, could not silence him. The city was hushed in the dimming hour, streets washed in the fading gold of sunset. Buildings stood as they always had, stone, steel, glass, unmoved by the verdict, unmoved by the years. Their facades caught the last light, cold surfaces, reflecting a world that did not change for one man's grief. The father walked with his coat draped over his arm, his pace steady, his shoulders unbowed. The courthouse lay behind him now, its columns still gleaming in the distance, but its judgment already dissolving into memory. Around him, the city carried on. Traffic pulsed, neon signs flickered alive, shop windows glowed. Life moved indifferent to justice. His son walked beside him, lips still sealed, gaze lowered. The boy's silence was not broken, not here, not yet. It traveled with them like a shadow, inseparable, a scar that spoke in absence. They passed street lamps sputtering too. Life, halos of light pushing back the dark. Pedestrians glanced, then looked away. Few recognized him, fewer still understood the weight of the steps he took, but each stride carried a refusal, each footfall a testament. He had not bowed. At an intersection, he paused. The setting sun bled. Across the horizon, a thin line of fire swallowed slowly by steel towers. Above, the first stars pierced through the haze, faint, almost hidden. He watched for a moment, then moved on. The system endured. The walls of the station still stood. The badges still gleamed. The machinery of silence still turned its wheels, but so did he. The verdict had not dismantled the structure. It had not restored his son's voice. It had not even named the violence for what it was. Yet it had marked a fracture, a refusal, a record carved into the stone of indifference. He walked with dignity intact, each step measured, his gait steady against the vast machinery surrounding him. Behind them, the courthouse lights flickered brighter, their glow cutting into the night. Ahead, the city stretched endless, indifferent, yet waiting. The silence of his son remained. The silence of his father never came. And in that, there was something the system could not erase.